this is going to be a presentation that's a little different from the ones that you've seen this morning, even though it's going to take us back, at least I hope, to several of the questions that have already been raised, both today and during the previous days of our symposium. Unlike a lot of people here, I work on a very outdated medium, the novel. And what I'm going to present today largely revolves around a novel, a contemporary novel, titled The Fear Index, written by Robert Harris, published in the UK in 2001. I don't know, has anyone read the novel? Je ne sais pas si ça a été traduit en français. And some problems of reading, so of interpretation and hermeneutics, that this novel poses in the context precisely of several of the issues that animate our seminar. I want to begin by briefly sketching out the larger project of which this presentation is a part. I'll then discuss the novel specifically, and I will try to do some conceptual work through my reading of the novel. I, in fact, am of the opinion that literary texts think. I always try to think through literary texts, and what I'm doing is always in pursuit of this literary thought, this fictional and ultimately also speculative thought. So, for the past 2 years, I've been at work on a project that I'm tentatively calling Finance Fictions. It asks a basic and, in fact, almost naive or crude question. What is the effect of money on people? I'm looking at contemporary novels, mostly US novels from the 70s, i.e. after the Nixon administration's unilateral abolition of the gold standard, producing the so-called Nixon shock, to the present, and I'm also including a few films in my analysis to see what answers these novels and films have given to my basic question, so what is the effect of money on people? My focus is specifically on psychopathologies, so on the sicknesses of the mind or the spirit that money, and in particular what Marx called fictitious capital, fictives Kapital, he defines it in the 3rd volume of Capital as, and this is a quote, value in the form of credit, shares, debt, speculation, and various forms of paper money, above and beyond what can be realized in the form of commodities. So what are the effects of this kind of money, the psychopathological effects of this kind of money on people? So my general question, again, that was already raised by Diego the other day, is what does money do to us? And then this is a more historical variant of it. How is that doing transformed by the historical transformations that money has gone through? My title for today, Econuméripanique, is partly meant as a joke. It's not a French word, is it? No. It's a word that evokes, in the very way it is constituted, something of the panic that it is referring to. In my most panicky moments, I sometimes start talking like this, coming up with terms like this. At the same time, I'm proposing the notion very seriously as a kind of concept that may help us not only to understand, but also to navigate our contemporary situation, specifically our contemporary psychic situation. The word Econuméripanique came to me while I was doing some research on Harris's novel, The Fear Index, and it's a book that Greengrass is apparently turning into a film. It should be finished at some point next year. Set against the background of the so-called flash crash of May 6, 2010, the day when, some of you may remember, the Dow Jones Industrial Index suffered the biggest 1-point decline in its history, the novel records 24 hours in the life of its main character, Dr. Alexander Hoffman, from the moment when he receives a copy of the first run of the first edition of Charles Darwin's The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animal from 1872, and is leafing through it in the study of his $60 million house in Geneva, Switzerland, to when he is lying unconscious in bed at the city's university hospital, badly burnt and with multiple fractures. On the night when he receives the $10,000 Darwin book in the mail, he later confirms that it was ordered and paid for by him, even though he cannot remember doing so. Alex has a violent run-in with a home invader who appears to have had knowledge of the codes to dismantle his house's state-of-the-art security system. He lives in a kind of fortress, in fact. Throughout the day, more evidence comes to light suggesting that someone is using his email account in an attempt to destroy him. Someone's really after me, he confesses to his business partner, Hugo Quarry. out to destroy me bit by bit. And it's not only Alex who is under attack, whoever is behind this is attempting to take down Alex's company as well. The company in question, pardon me, it's called Hoffman Investment Technologies, is a hedge fund. Asked by the policeman who has come to investigate the home invasion what the company makes, Hoffman dryly replies, "It makes money." Like others in the finance world, Hoffman came to Switzerland in the 90s at the height of the era that his partner Hugo describes as the Coke and Call Girl glory days, to work for CERN, so the European Organization for Nuclear Research, on the Large Hadron Collider. So he's in fact a scientist. After about 6 years of working as a physicist, he was lured away by the world of finance. Not because he wanted to work for a bank, he makes that quite clear to Hugo when he comes to recruit him, but because the finance world enables him to progress with his research on autonomous machine learning. CERN had to put a stop to this research because an algorithm that Alex had designed went out of control and started affecting the organization's systems like a virus, and so they had to put it down. And so Alex designs a project of behavioral finance, I think Diego already used the term yesterday, that makes him and several others fabulously rich. However, in a speech to the team that he's working with at the hedge fund, he insists that it's never been just about the money. Instead, he thanks them for the scientific progress they have made. In this more economic, less scientific case, too, however, it turns out that the algorithm that Alex has created has gone rogue, and now it is Alex himself who will try to shut it down. That's what the plot of the novel amounts to. It's a story about a mad scientist gone hedge fund trying to pull the plug on the digital life form that he has created. Of course, you know this kind of story. For example, from Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey, and some reviewers of Harris's novel have in fact mentioned Kubrick's HAL in their reviews, comparing it to the algorithm that Alex has created. The story also rings a few other bells. Set in Geneva, it recalls, first of all, Mary Shelley's novel Frankenstein, and Harris includes explicit references to this text in his book. Many of the novel's chapters are also introduced with quotes from books by Darwin, not just the already mentioned Expressions of the Emotions, but also on the origin of species and the descent of man, which I think I already mentioned this morning, and if I remember correctly, it was one of the required texts for the seminar that you taught as well. What makes Harris's novel unique, and I think uniquely contemporary, is that these two sources of inspiration, so both Shelley and Darwin, are then combined with the world of economics. Other mottos introducing the novel chapters are taken from Bill Gates' Business at the Speed of Thought, or from various other luminaries in the world of high finance. While the novel is set against a specific background of the flash crash, a crash that the novel in fact suggests Alex's algorithm may in fact have created. As far as I know, we still don't know exactly what created the flash crash. There's many different hypotheses. Its general background is the austerity crisis in Europe, and particularly in Greece. So I'm interested in this text because you get here, at least from my perspective, a fascinating, really explosive mix of stuff that combines many of the elements that we've already discussed in the previous days. Evolutionary theory is there, the rise of the digital is there, the contemporary situation as well. In fact, I think the novel suggests that those military robots that our friend Patrick Krogan was discussing yesterday are already at work in our economies. And they are out to make a killing. Some of you may know this line, it's Wall Street lingo for making a huge profit. So the projection presented to us by Patrick yesterday, that by 2047 half of the US military will consist of robots, I think that was part of the visuals that he showed, in fact strikes me as hugely outdated. I wouldn't be surprised if most of the intelligences functioning in our economic markets today are already artificial. The military is in fact way behind. The war is already with us. As the title of Harris's novel reveals, and this is what interests me in the novel specifically, the Fear Index is a fiction about fear, and more specifically panic, which is in fact, as many of you know, an important topic in Bernard's work. The novel deals with panic both at the personal level and in its mass form, as when, for example, the market panics. In fact, Alex's body in the novel becomes something like the site where the panic of the market is played out. It's a body economic, as a phrase that's actually used in the novel, so to speak, and I use the phrase here in parallel with the more familiar term body politic, and one that, like the body of Victor Frankenstein's creature in Shelley's novel, risks to come apart at the seams. In the state of panic, private, public, in which he is caught up, Alex is turned into a creature, a being not only in between human and animal life, as contemporary theorists of creatureliness have insisted, but also digital life. Someone who seems to have lost all control over the determinants of his existence. And you can see this growing interest in fear, and then specifically panic, very clearly in the development of the text. As you see, I'm trying to perform a little bit an exercise of reading, of interpretation, a hermeneutic, in fact, for you today. Early on in the novel, when Alex is on the tracks of the unknown man who has invaded his house, he can still insist that while he is afraid, he felt no panic. This is a quote from page 13. Panic was quite different to fear, he, Alex, was discovering. Panic was moral and nervous collapse, a waste of precious energy, whereas fear was all sinew and instinct, an animal that stood up on its hind legs and filled you completely, that took control of your brain and muscles. Some 40 pages later, however, when he finds out, Alex that is, that he did not place the Darwin book order that originated from his email account, the confidence leaked from his voice and he felt almost physically sick with panic, as if an abyss was opening at his feet. Another 80 pages later, when he realizes that his marriage is disintegrating because of the crises in which he has landed, panic welled up inside him again. At his office later on, he tries very hard not to create a panic among the traders who work for him, but as the crisis around his algorithm grows, panic invades their minds, this is then on page 258, and their bodies anyways. Meanwhile, of course, the market is panicking. The novel is clearly a story, I hope that my various citations show that, of an individual and collective disintegration, and I would also add disindividuation, into panic, because that's what panic is, of course. It's an individual and collective disindividuation. In the genre of the finance novel, the fear index can thus be categorized as a panic novel. This is in fact a term that's used in English language literary studies. You have finance novels and then a very specific subgenre that's called panic novels, novels that deal with panics of the market. And as that particular subgenre of economic fiction, it focuses on panic that is produced by, and that also produces partly, a market crash. Now, given the particular set of elements that the novel presents, panic related to the digital economy, I'm tempted to get even more specific and refer to it as an Econuméripanique novel, continuing the tradition of the panic novel with a significant dose of technophobia, and one could even say high technophobia or digitotechnophobia mixed in. Ça va, vous pouvez comprendre avec le texte qui est là? Yeah? Great. Non, ça ne va pas? C'était de l'ironie, ça? D'accord. Parce que comme j'ai vécu 10 ans aux États-Unis, j'oublie parfois l'ironie européenne qui est toujours là, bien sûr, dans les commentaires. Now, I would like to include a few words on panic, because that's really my key topic for today, as a contemporary psychopathology of the spirit. As something that, as a pathology that affects both the I and the we, prevents the collaboration between brains that our summer school is in fact interested in. In his work, Franco Bifo Berardi, who was mentioned this morning by Geert and who is a contemporary theorist of capitalism, specifically of cognitive capitalism, has recalled the origins of the word panic. As most of you no doubt know, it can be traced back to the Greek god Pan. Half goat, half human, like a satyr, he was the god of the wild, of shepherds and of flocks, and also of hunting and rustic music, associated with sexuality, polygamy, eroticism, masturbation, rape, lust, and so on and so forth, and also fertility, and a companion of the nymphs as well, many of whom suffered a terrible fate because he pursued them. He was usually worshipped in a natural setting, a cave, for example. Some theories have it that he is the son of Zeus. Others suggest, and this is I think quite interesting for us, that he's the son of Hermes and the nymph Penelope of Mantinea. Apparently she later became confused with the Penelope from the Odyssey, and Pan was thought to be the son of Penelope's intercourse with all of her 108 suitors. Probably one of the oldest gods, many have also noted that he is the only god who dies. Pan hon megas tetneke, the great Pan has died, was a cry that was popular with the Romantics because it evoked the loss of human beings' relation to nature, to, as Bifo puts it in his book Precarious Rhapsody, to the overwhelming flow of reality, things, and information that we are surrounded by. Now, if Hermes is the god of interpretation, his son Pan thus marks a state where interpretation risks to become impossible, where the possibility of a hermeneutics risks to disappear entirely. The state of panic is a state in which you are no longer able to interpret, and this prevents individual and collective individuation, as I've already said. Now, with panic in the Greek sense of the word, this was not yet fully the case. This is why the Romantics could still mourn Pan's death. Pan also still marked a relation to nature. However, what Bifo argues is that today, panic names a much more grave psychopathology of cognitive capitalism, a pathology produced by a contemporary economic situation in which the mind and the brain have become the new focus of laboring. And I think Bernard already evoked this morning with reference to Maurizio Lazzarato's work. One of the theorists of this new form of capitalism, Bifo, has repeatedly discussed panic in his work on the subject. This is a quote from Bifo. "We can speak of panic," he writes, "when we see a conscious organism, individual or social, being overwhelmed by the speed of processes he or she is involved in and has no time to process the information input. In these cases, the organism, all of a sudden, is no more able to process the sheer amount of information coming into its cognitive field, or even that which is being generated by the organism itself." A little later on in the same book, and so the book I'm quoting from is Precarious Rhapsody, he writes, "The mental environment is saturated by signs that create a sort of continuous excitation, a permanent electrocution, which leads the individual mind as well as the collective mind to a state of collapse." He articulates this issue in both a temporal and a spatial way. He notes that it's associated with the acceleration of time, and he also insists that the problem is particularly present in urban environments. In his other books, he in fact casts a picture of what I would call, in contrast to Plato's utopian Kallipolis, a dystopian Panipolis. Bernard has made this point as well in the second volume of Discredit and Disbelief, stating that because this panic affects all of us, we are now all, or nearly all, urban. I know it's hard to believe here in Épinay, but I think you can still understand why both Bernard and Bifo insist on the urban as a way to name the generalized condition of proletarianization that they are both diagnosing. Now, as Bernard in his work through a discussion of Pandora's box, in fact insists on hope in addition to fear in this context, Bifo's conclusions, at least the way I read them, but you should feel free to disagree with me on this, especially if you know better the Italian context and maybe even Bifo. Personally, I've only met him a few times. His conclusions, from my perspective, tend to be quite negative. And at first sight, Harris's novel appears to confirm this negativity. It in fact repeats many of Bifo's theses in the form of a novel. Nevertheless, I think there is a sight of hope, but a very peculiar one in the novel as well. And so let me explain to you a little bit where I consider it to be located. The fear index's interest in panic, and specifically in Econuméripanique, is the particular way in which it fills in a recurrent theme in the finance novel, and that's the theme of psychosis. Over and over again, maybe you can think already of some examples. If you know any in the French context, please do let me know afterwards. I'm very interested in beginning to build an archive of some of these texts. So over and over again, finance novels will present psychosis as the affliction produced in their main narrator or character due to the influence of money. So what's the effect on money on people? It renders them psychotic. You can think here, this is probably the most famous example in the American context of Bret Easton Ellis's terrifying novel, American Psycho. In a text that was published in a book called The Psychopathologies of Cognitive Capitalism, it's a book that I co-edited with the artist Warren Neidig after a conference we organized in LA last November, and then we did a second part in Berlin just a few months ago. Maurizio Lazzarato spoke there, in fact. I presented a contemporary tale of psychosis, Robert Bloch's Psycho, based on the true story of the psychotic murderer Ed Gein and turned into a film by Alfred Hitchcock, as a model for this kind of thought. Everyone focuses, of course, in their discussion of the novel and the film on Norman Bates, as the psycho referred to in the title. But I tried to show that Mary, or Marion Crane, is rendered psychotic by the money she steals, which is in fact what the film starts with. You know, there's money that's being stolen there, and everyone appears to forget about that afterwards, partly because Norman Bates is, of course, not interested in the money. He doesn't know it's there. It disappears into the swamp with Marion's car and her body. So, in this sense, as Bloch's novel repeats over and over again, all of us are a little psychotic because of our dealings with money. And a recent film on Hitchcock, some of you may have seen it, which revolved around the making of Psycho, I think the title of the film is just Hitchcock, focused on the trouble that Hitchcock had financing his film. The whole film kind of revolves around that. I don't want to challenge the importance of psychosis when we were talking about the effects of capitalism on the psyche and on desire today. One could argue, and Bernard has done so, that capitalism has led to the destruction of desire, i.e. to kind of generalized psychosis that affects all of us, whether we are wealthy, like Alan Greenspan, who was mentioned this morning, or not. But I'm still going to move away from the psychotic diagnosis just a little bit to foreground something else that's going on in the novel and that I find within this tradition of finance novels even more interesting. The reason why I'm interested in the Fear Index is because this novel takes up an interesting place in the tradition of finance writings dealing with psychosis. For while it clearly recalls this topos of psychosis, much of the madness that happens in the novel is blamed by the characters surrounding Alex on what they think is an outburst of psychosis. Alex, in fact, had a psychotic episode while he still was at CERN. And the novel includes a scene towards the end of the book that explicitly references the famous shower scene in Hitchcock. The novel also ultimately rejects this hypothesis, i.e. everything is to blame on Alex's psychosis, to insist instead that it is the algorithm that Alex has created that is responsible for everything that happens to him and also to the market. We are dealing here, in fact, in this particular Panic novel, with a problem of reading, of interpretation, of hermeneutics. We're being thrown back, I would argue, from the son, Pan, onto the father, Hermes. Something is evidently happening to Alex Hoffman on May 6th, 2010. There are symptoms. I've mentioned the Darwin book that he receives. He supposedly ordered it, but he can't remember doing so. There's also the home invasion. But the problem is how those symptoms are to be read. So it's essentially a problem of reading, not just this particular novel, but also the whole tradition of finance novels in which it is to be placed. Everyone around Alex blames what happens to him on his psychosis. And while this is not entirely ungrounded, Alex did indeed have a psychotic episode as a scientist a while ago, the novel in fact shows that this is not the correct reading, right? What's happening to Alex is happening for the same reason that the market is crashing. Destruction of the individual and the collective are due to the algorithm that Alex has created and that has gone rogue in pursuit of insanely high profits. In response to the traditional hypothesis offered in finance novels that whoever is caught up in the finance world is psychotic, like Patrick Bateman, for example, the reality that is presented here is slightly different. While Alex has had a psychotic episode, what is happening to him now is not due to his psychosis, but to the instruments of finance capital that he, as a scientist, has helped create. These instruments, which he created in an attempt, in fact, to navigate all of the information that is out there, i.e. partly as a way to prevent panic, have turned into arms that are not turning against him. They are attacking him, and they are attacking the market in which they operate. With this conclusion, the novel in fact partly reorients our attention within its analysis of panic from the psychosis of its main character, Alex Hoffman, to the instruments of finance capital and their pharmacology. And this is why, again, within the tradition in which the novel is to be situated, I find it an interesting text. There's very few novels doing that. While they are designed to manage information, these instruments of finance capital, i.e. to counteract the panic that our loss of control in the face of the overwhelming flow of information today might produce, they end up producing a wholly different panic that risks to destroy us altogether. In this sense, it is not Alex who, in the midst of all of this, is psychotic, but everyone around him. All those who try to blame the madness produced by the pharmaca of the finance world on Alex. I would argue that it is thus those who try to blame everything on Alex's psychosis and who thus fail to think the pharmacological situation of the finance world who are the real psychotics in the novel, because they refuse to see the reality of the world of finance capital, projecting their own psychosis onto the only one who realizes what is actually going on. The novel is in fact a kind of, I think in French you say a roman de formation, a Bildungsroman, about a scientist who produces an algorithm and slowly but surely begins to realize that what he thought would help him navigate the overflow of information today is turning against him. A very interesting Bildungsroman. It's almost an unbildungsroman in that sense. The novel traces the development, as I just said, of a scientist who creates an instrument, an algorithm to manage information today, realizes that this instrument is turning against him at the moment when everyone else is in fact ignoring it. So it's about a scientist gone hedge fund manager who discovers the pharmacon. Harris's fiction thus practices something like what I'm tempted to call, borrowing this term really very loosely from Mark Fisher, a capitalist realism. I know that's not what Mark Fisher makes it refer to, but coming out of my previous work on realism, I thought this was a very interesting notion I could play with. Very little of what happens in the novel can be blamed on Alex's psychosis. The events are instead realistic and due to the pharmaca of the finance world. Whereas some have presented this plot as grossly exaggerated and thus as extremely unrealistic, in fact it's mostly reviewers writing for finance newspapers or journals who take that position. I actually think it's highly sobering and reintroduces some reason, namely a pharmacology, into the unreason of panic that the novel captures. Pharmacology thus begins to operate here as a therapeutic against Econuméripanique. The problem is in the novel, and this is why this is sort of a peculiar side of hope, Alex then slips into what was already called this morning a negative pharmacology. He tries to destroy the algorithm. He's not successful. And that's kind of where the novel ends. This is obviously not a solution either, so I'm not quite sure where I want to go with the reading of the novel at this point, but I thought this foregrounding of the instruments of finance capital coming out of science also in this particular situation was very interesting. That's why I did some work around this text. Now, what I'd like to propose, and here's why I'm returning to my general theoretical framework, is that it's what I'm calling a finance fiction, that Harris's novel is able to partly counteract the psychopathology of panic produced by an extreme contemporary version of what Marx, again in the third volume of Capital, already called fictitious capital. So I'm proposing the notion of a finance fiction as an antidote to the psychopathologies produced by fictitious capital. You see how I'm reversing the terms here, right? By reversing the term of Marx's fictitious capital and insisting on the fiction instead of on the capital, I want to underline the psychopolitical importance of fiction in this context. There's in fact an interview that's available online on the website of Harris's novel where Robert Harris does more or less the same thing. I think that fiction has an important role to play in the reorientation of our minds and our brains in contemporary capitalism's battle for the spirit. Which is why I would add, if I could, but I see the master has disappeared, at least one novel, this may be good, at least one novel to the set of texts that are on the reading list for his seminar. Because the novel also, as Nicholas Carr knows very well, it trains a different kind of attention. So I think it's very important that we keep teaching it, even if it's 400 pages or 500 pages. Some contemporary theorists of capitalism have been making this point more or less directly, and often, in particular in the case of the Italians, with reference to the very medium through which novelists develop their fictions, language. I think it was Paul Émile who insisted the other day on the toxicity of language today. Is something that interests me very much as well. Christian Marazzi, for example, has used, so this is some folks from this Italian scene, has used J.L. Austin's category of the performative, already mentioned by Bernard a few days ago, to explain how contemporary capital operates. He argues that it is nothing but performative. It should be noted, however, that both Marazzi and Bifo have pushed this argument even further, saying that the nature of contemporary finance capital is reflected not just in performative utterances, so utterances of the kind I, the treasurer, declare that this piece of paper is worth $100, but in all utterances and in language as such, which is arguably a point that Derrida has already made. Capital has become linguistic, they argue, and by this they mean that it refers to nothing other than itself. Money and language have something in common, Bifo writes in his recent book, The Uprising. They are nothing and they move everything. Whereas capital, in Marx's useful formulation, comes about through the MCM accent cycle, in which money leads to more money through the intermediary of the commodity, C. In the world of finance capital, these folks argue, M leads to M with an accent without that intermediary of the commodity. And you can think here, this is exactly what Alex says when he replies in response to the cop who asks him, what does your company make? He doesn't say commodities, he says, it makes money. It's a company who makes money, yeah? So it's M accent. What is traded in global markets today are no longer goods, but complex financial instruments like swaps or derivatives, immaterial constructs that even professionals like Alan Greenspan or Ben Bernanke have some difficulty understanding. Bifo speaks in this context of semio-capitalism, a capitalism that operates through the logic of the sign, of a sign that refers to nothing other of itself, and of which I would say there can thus be no hermeneutic. It's a sign of panic, in a way. Now, it's one thing to understand that capitalism today is a capitalism that operates like a language, that it is a semio-capitalism, a capitalism of the sign. Such an approach, however, privileges the term capitalism and always begins from this side of the equation, capital is language. By approaching the issue here from the perspective of literature, one of the privileged realms of science, I would like to reframe the question from the other side. What happens to language under these conditions? What happens to literature and to narrative, and it was Ricardo who started by insisting on narrative the other day, when their very medium is being saturated by capital? Finally, what happens to human beings, those beings who have language in this context, to their individual and collective agency, given that language, literature, narrative are key elements for the collaboration between brains, for psychic and collective individuation? My suggestion is that this situation produces a state of generalized disorientation, where the very practices that help human beings to orient their lives, language, storytelling, filmmaking, etc., are at the risk of becoming utterly meaningless. Marx captures this situation, I think, though he of course does not develop it as such, with the term fictitious capital, fictives capital. So you can read that phrase one way, as naming capitals being rendered fictitious and ultimately speculative in an unprecedented way, but the transfer also goes in the other direction, right? Fiction is becoming closely associated with capital here, and it is worth wondering about the consequences of the association from this direction as well. And in the US, you have someone like the poet Joshua Clover, who's taken up this kind of project, mostly in relation to poetry's relation to capital. It's in this loaded context, and in fact a context that's not entirely readable, interpretable to me yet, I'm still working on this of course, that I would like to launch this notion of a finance fiction as a psychopolitical practice that would help human beings navigate the realities of the contemporary finance world. So I'm trying to think of finance fiction as an affirmative psychopolitical tool, a tool that would be able to turn the psychopower to which we're passively exposed around, so that we can begin to become the active subjects of the politics that shape, and the economies, in fact, that shape our minds and brains, so that we can begin to imagine and invent again individual and collective forms of life. As I see it, this is a question of reclaiming fiction within a culture of fictitious capital in order to help us navigate the pitfalls of contemporary finance. One of the practices that I think are extremely important in this context, and in fact the film last night underlined that I think very well in relation to different issues, but I think you could mobilize this in this context as well, is the creation of new vocabularies. And I think for that reason it's extremely important that the Ars Industrialis vocabulary was published at the end of Bernard's last book. I think I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you very much for listening.